Not long after my 10-year high school reunion, I took swing dancing lessons with a friend of mine. Dancing was not at all an easy thing to do for me. I felt awkward in my body. I would step on my partner's toes, and it was very difficult, as I'm sure you can imagine, for me to learn not to lead. Learning to swing dance was an exercise in humility, in being a beginner. But once the music started, once I was in the act, it was so freeing, and all I had to do was follow. It was also a workout, but what hurt the most were not my legs or my feet. I came away from every single class with my face hurting, and it wasn't because I fell, although I'm sure you can imagine that too. But it was because I was grinning ear to ear, non-stop for an hour. So my cheeks were hurting. It was very strange. I was smiling and I didn't even know it most of the time. I was completely and totally surprised by my own joy. Joy is somewhat of a mystery to us. And for most of the people I've talked to this week, joy is an emotion reserved for babies and children, puppies and colts. It is spoken about fondly with a sense of nostalgia, and is thought to be this emotion that happens only to the naive or the ignorant. And I mean that in the true sense of the word, those who simply do not know. But something happens to us when we begin to know. We change with our responsibilities, with a fuller picture of the world. There's an allegory of which I'm certain you are all familiar that speaks to this rite of passage in our lives, this loss of innocence and beginning of our knowing. It goes like this. At the head of 4 rivers was a garden, and in that vast and beautiful garden lived a man and a woman. To them, all was given, the plants and the trees and the animals. The garden was abundant with life. And the man and the woman were innocent. All was provided for them. They were free to eat from the entire garden, except for the forbidden tree in the very center of the garden. The tree in the center. How tempting is that? Everywhere they went, they would pass it. They couldn't avoid seeing that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye. And so the man and the woman were tempted, and they ate of the fruit of that forbidden tree of knowledge. Now immediately, they began to know. Their eyes were opened to good and evil. They realized that they were naked, and for the very first time in their lives, they felt shame. As a consequence, the man and the woman were both cursed by God to painful labor, one of the soil and the other in childbirth. They lost their freedom to live without toil. They lost their innocence. So although they did not die as God had warned, something inside them did in fact die that day, as they were made aware of their vulnerabilities, their own death, and the difference between right and wrong. This coming of age happens to each and every one of us. At some point in our lives, we become self-conscious, and the games that we play as children become about winning or losing instead of about the company that we keep. Our children become embarrassed by attention, and at some point, many of us even lose the ability to celebrate. As the tasks become more important than taking the time to be curious and filled with awe, time takes on a different form. It becomes a commodity that must be managed in order to get our needs met. Now, I'm not suggesting that it's preferable to live a life entirely of play, or even that that would be desirable. There's actually a joke on this topic going around the internet that you might have heard these days about a Lutheran who goes into heaven. He has a large suitcase in his hand, and when he arrives, St. Peter asks him, "Brother, why are you carrying that luggage with you? There's no need for that here." The Lutheran takes a deep breath and says very seriously, "Well, I won't be staying long." There is something to that, maybe a little bit of Lutheran in all of us, that recognizes that any state of bliss may in fact be temporary, and that there is always work to be done. And there is much satisfaction in work well done. I'm afraid, though, that over time we begin to identify our entire lives with the tasks and the toil, and we lose the ability to recognize or express joy altogether. There's no room for that in our lives. Even when we can feel joy knocking at the door of our hearts, it's as though we shoo it away, as if it doesn't deserve entry, as though it hasn't quite earned the right to visit. What creates room for the joy of babies and children and puppies and colts and Adam and Eve is a combination of freedom and innocence, having all of their needs met and being oblivious to the complexity and the tragedy in the world. With those two things, they are free to be bound effortless in joy. I see it every morning, actually. Near my home, where I run in the mornings, I have two opportunities to experience unbridled joy. One, in a very literal sense, as I make my way to the paved road, I walk past a horse farm. Not long after we moved in, 4 colts were born, and we've been watching them grow up since June. They are so incredibly beautiful. And every morning, they run along the pasture and play with one another joyously, while their mothers eat incessantly nearby in order to provide enough nourishment for both mother and colt. Then, once I'm on the paved road, most mornings I'm greeted by the absolute goofiest Labrador I have ever met. He comes joyous and playful to greet my dog, Maddie, and I, and at first I always have to smile at him because he's so adorable. And the joy is almost contagious. But I find myself swatting away my affection and my joy like a nuisance. And I'm afraid that too often we swat away and do not allow joy in our own lives, because it causes a certain amount of dis-ease. Something in our now adult rational mind does not compute. How can we possibly be joyful when there's so much pain in the world? We think those around us who are joyful must be ignorant. They must not know about all the suffering in the world. Why don't I tell them? And since we don't want to be associated with the ignorant, we rein in that joy for something more practical. I'm tempted here to say more Puritan. But other people's joy can also make us envious, jealous, and even angry. We might think, how could you possibly have any joy about that, something that simple? Or how could you have so much joy? Or maybe we think, how could you have more joy than me? Certainly you don't have the full picture. Maybe your mind goes to judgment and you find yourself thinking, you see, I know something you don't know. The world is full of pain and loss and suffering, so get serious. It's like we have this 1950s schoolmarm in our minds telling us to quit being so silly. And I don't think that I am alone in this thinking. And now that it's named, it just seems absolutely ridiculous to me.